Our speakers today are Randy Estabrook, QCC Executive Director, Wayne Hintz, QCP Project Manager, and Greg Parham, QCP Inspections Manager. Randy, Wayne, Greg, on behalf of AWI, thank you for being with us today and sharing your knowledge and expertise. I will now turn the floor over to you.
Thanks for once again getting us up and running, Cameron. Hope everyone out there is doing well. This is Wayne Hintz, QCP Manager. Thanks for using some of your valuable and I'm sure all too scarce time to hear what we have to say this afternoon and hopefully help us discuss some of the points. A little background on what we're going to cover today. Some of you may have attended a webinar we presented last September called the QCP Inspection Process Before, During, and After. And in that presentation, we listed and discussed various QCP administrative and procedural requirements that our licensed participating companies encounter during the course of a typical inspected certified project, and we offered some advice on how to navigate those requirements so that in the end the woodworker would obtain the holy grail, which is of course the project certificate. Today's presentation is sort of a matching bookend to that previous webinar, since we are going to talk once again about navigating the road to project certification. But this time we're going to do that from the standpoint of technical standards-related issues that seem to come up with some regularity in the inspection reports that we receive from QCP's field representatives. So this is kind of our top 15 things to avoid. And as with our previous webinar, our purpose today is to help your company circumvent any certification glitches that some of these technical gremlins have been known to cause. And hopefully this might save you some grief at some point. And bear in mind also that although our presentation today is comprised of examples drawn from inspected projects, the items we are covering obviously also apply to those QCP projects which your company self-certifies if you have gone through the provisional stage of licensing and are a self-certifying company. You know, we never see those self-labeled projects, but everything we are going to discuss today applies to those as well. And for that matter, they really apply equally to projects which are non-QCP and that only specify conformance with the AWI standards. Greg is going to begin with a discussion of a couple of things, including some aspects of the shop drawing review, that is the QCP shop drawing review. So take it away, Greg.
Okay, thank you, Wayne, and hopefully everybody can hear me clearly here. Of course, the object of this whole exercise is to achieve the certificate of compliance. So let's begin with the starting point for QCP project registration. One of the most common comments we hear from woodworkers is, but the architect is supposed to register the project. We also get a lot of calls from architects saying they were told by the woodworker they had to register the project. The reality is, while anyone can register the project, it is the woodworker's responsibility to make sure it is registered or register it themselves. And as you see here, we've listed that section of the policies here on the screen. And as a reminder, the project registration can be completed online at our website in a matter of minutes, and it's always free. Just go to our website as shown here, awiqcp.org, and select the gold button that states register a project and complete the form. Next issue we run into a lot is not paying label fees. This issue usually involves new licensees, but we also see it occur with firms that have not performed a lot of QCP projects. It may have been several years since they had performed their first QCP project. So please remember there are 2 steps in the process. One is registering the project. This lets QCP know the project requires certification. And the second is paying the label fees. This is what makes the project eligible for certification. And again, the label fees can also be paid online on our website. And this is a screenshot of our homepage showing where you would go. The menu on the left where it says select projects, that is in green here, and then select the order labels in the pull down menu that appears. Now if you want to pay by check, when you go to the order form, there is a link there that will allow you to print the form out. You can complete it and mail in your check. We do ask that if you do mail in the check, to please remember to indicate the project number on the check so that we can be sure the fees are properly applied. The next issue we run into a lot is paying the label fees late. This issue seems to be most common for companies that have been self-labeling for a year or more. Oftentimes we hear the comment that the QCP guy has moved on and everyone else didn't know, or it has just become a general practice to request the labels when the project is nearing completion. Please be aware, a self-labeling company can still be subject to an inspection on any QCP project. An inspection can occur at the request of a party to the contract. A project can be selected by QCP for a random inspection, or a 3-year project inspection is due. Failing to follow the policies not only puts your company at risk of revocation, but the project itself may not receive certification, and the licensee can end up on probation and then has to pay all the costs of inspection on their next project. This is a label order form that we mail to licensee. I just want to point out here that QCP does attempt to help you to remember to order the labels. If we are informed the licensee has been awarded the project, we send this certification request order form, which is the same thing as a label order, as an attachment to an email to the person that is listed in our files as the contact for the firm. This form is sent out monthly until the fees are paid. So please always check your junk mail and also make sure that the AWIQCP.org is set as a safe sender in your email program. You may also want to make sure that if you are the project manager on a project, to ask around the firm there, because the contact that we have may be somebody else within the firm that's been receiving these and just doesn't know what to do with them. So what can you do to avoid registration and label order errors? Our recommendations would be to cross-train your project managers, estimators, engineers, draftsmen in the process. This eliminates the QCP guy. Everybody knows what is required and are more likely to try and stay on top of it. We also recommend that you register a project when you are bidding. I know we have several of our licensees that do this on a regular basis. That way it's registered, and it also gives us the opportunity to help you out by checking with the architect on a regular basis to see that if the project has been awarded. And if it has been awarded to a non-licensee in the program, we alert the architect to let them know that the project has been awarded to a non-licensee and that the project could not receive certification. The other thing to consider would be to add a checklist or other tracking method so that the requirements aren't missed. So now let's move on to common errors in shop drawings. One of the common misconceptions that we have found is that woodworkers think that if a shop drawings are submitted with materials that vary from the project specifications and or the standards, for example, using melamine cabinet interiors are indicated in a section detail drawing that have been submitted instead of the specified high-pressure laminate interiors, and these drawings are then stamped and signed by the design professional, then the change in melamine materials has been approved. The reality, under QCP policies, unless the drawings have a note or the melamine interior is bubbled to clearly indicate the change, and the design professional has initialed the change, or the woodworker has an approved permission to modify, or RFI, the change to melamine is not permitted. This is outlined in the policies as shown here. The participants must comply with the minimum requirements of the standards despite deviations from the standards, which may be included in the reviewed or approved shop drawings. And under that, the deviation from minimum requirements is permitted solely in cases where such deviations are clearly noted in the contract documents and or submittals for which there is written acceptance by the design professional. This slide is an example of a typical shop drawing stamp I'm sure many of you have seen. I have highlighted the key terms indicating that the review does not relieve the contractor from compliance with the requirements of the drawings and the specifications. In other words, shop drawing approval does not equal permission to modify.
Hey, Greg, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
What happens in the case of a mock-up?
Mock-up will also require, if you have changed from the specifications, you would need to point those out to the architect in writing so that he is aware of the changes and has signed off on them. Moving on here, this is just want to show where this is also addressed in the standards. This is a page out of the new standards, the second edition, page 27 under industry practices. And this is a screenshot of part of the section 1 of the new standards. I just wanted to give everybody a heads up as we move forward into 2015 and you start seeing the first projects that are falling under the second edition of the new standards. In the second edition, there are actually additional requirements addressing the requirements for separate approval for variances that have been added to the standards portion of section 1 under submittals, and I have highlighted those key items on the screen here. Now let's look at the most common nonconformities found in drawings. Please note that the references that are cited here refer to the second edition of the AWS. However, all of the items that are noted here are also required in the first edition of the AWS. So the first most common nonconformity is incomplete materials listings for the following: case door and drawer front, both the core, outside, and inside face material, including the grade and thickness. Drawer boxes, the sides, front, back, and bottom panel with the construction method. Second item is the failure to detail location of all required internal wall blocking. Failure to provide finishing requirements, including finish system applied. Failure to provide a reference plan. And the fifth is insufficient construction detail. This includes the dimensions necessary to construct cabinets and details on the joinery and connections, including installation. We do get a lot of questions in regards to what was required in terms of the dimensions. The way I explain it to most woodworkers is that if I cannot take a woodworker, a person with a good general knowledge of woodworking, and take your drawings and give them to them, and they be able to build the cabinet to their proper sizes, then you don't have enough dimensions in there necessary to construct the cabinets. So what do we recommend? First is to establish drawing templates that fully conform to the AWS standards with blocks for all the information required. Second is to commit using the templates for all your projects, so no one has to remember something different for a QCP project. This allows you to avoid making drawings for QCP projects and only when required process. This allows the practice to become more ingrained, and the likelihood of missing something is greatly reduced. Next item is to remember that checklists lead to success. So create checklists. If your standard method of construction or installation doesn't conform to the standards and you prefer to always build that way, create a checklist of these variances that can be easily transmitted to the architect for approval. The other item to consider is, when it comes to your shop drawings, is to use the AWS Standards Section 1 submittals as a shop drawing checklist. This is what the QCP reps do. This is an example of a shop drawing checklist that I created for this webinar. As you can see, I just basically put boxes outside each of the lines, and then I can mark off, is it there, does it not apply, or do I need to request permission to modify? This is exactly what our QCP reps do during a shop drawing review. They are going line by line off of the submittals. They will typically just copy it out of the book or have it in their computer where they can print it out, and they will set the checklist next to the drawings and go through it line by line. So this is where I turn the webinar back over to Wayne to discuss the typical nonconformities we find out during physical inspections.
Thanks, Greg. Here's a couple things to keep in mind as we go through these next slides. AWS, of course, denotes the architectural woodwork standards, and AWS is followed by either a 1 or a 2, which indicates the edition number. And as Greg alluded to, I'm sure you know that AWS Edition 2 was just released this past October 1st, so only for projects bid on or after October 1st is Edition 2 considered to be the current standard. Therefore, most of the projects you may currently have in the pipeline, AWS Edition 1 is the standard, which probably applies, but we are including in these slides the Edition 2 line item citations also, since before you know it, Edition 2 is going to be the standard you're using every day. The citations, which we're going to show you on the slides, some of them are more general, some of them have a little more detail, so we urge you to review these topics in the standard more comprehensively so that you have a full context for what we're talking about and all of the requirements for the items that we are discussing. Where a C appears on a slide, that indicates custom grade, and a P indicates premium grade. And finally, as we all know, if a designer's specification conflict line item, the specification supersedes the standard. The first item we're going to look at is cabinet back fastening, and we'll start with a tall cabinet. What you see in the slide here is a quote-unquote non-housed back screwed to a tall cabinet. Back in the days of the Quality Standards Illustrated, non-housed backs were called applied backs, and both terms simply mean that they are not captured anywhere in the cabinet body by a plow / dado / groove. Non-housed backs are required to be at least 1/2 inch thick and must be screwed on as opposed to stapled or nailed to the cabinet body. The screws may not exceed 4 inches on center, and any cabinet that is over 72 inches tall, which is not connected to an adjacent cabinet or installed with one of its sides adjacent to a structural wall, is required to have a fixed horizontal shelf, roughly dividing the cabinet in half. And if that fixed shelf is present, the back, of course, must be screwed to it, as well as any other additional cabinet body panels, like, for example, a vertical divider. This slide is showing you the backside of a couple of wall cabinets which are standing upside down on a shop floor. And the 3 staples circled by the dotted line are something like 10 inches on center, which was typical for all of the wall cabinets inspected on this project. The requirement for these housed backs is that they be stapled or nailed 4 inches on center. Then you see some anchor cleats which appear at the floor since the cabinets are upside down, and those must be glued. The backs are not required to be glued, but the anchor cleats must be glued and mechanically fastened a maximum of 4 inches on center also. The yellow arrows you see there are pointing to some screws that are fastening the anchor cleat, but they're about 12 inches on center. So both of these fastening issues would have to be corrected before this project could be certified. The back fastening and anchor strip requirements for base cabinets are similar. I should also mention that I've seen at least 2 projects where, and fairly large projects, where the staples are there at 4 inches on center, but the stapling was apparently done by someone inexperienced or in a hurry, and apparently the staple gun was not held at the proper angle. Therefore, none of the staples shot into the groove penetrated the back panel. So that's, of course, got to happen in order for any of this to matter. And in one of those projects, the result was a bunch of wall cabinets and their contents just slid off of their backs down the wall, leaving the backs and the cabinet tops still fastened to the wall, but everything was on the floor in pieces. So this particular standard can matter quite a bit. Second item we have is anchoring cabinets to structural walls. You're looking at an installed wall cabinet with its doors open. Our discussion of cabinet anchoring assumes that the conforming in-wall blocking that Greg mentioned needs to be on the shop drawings, shown on the shop drawings, is present in the building's structural walls. And the anchoring screws must be at least a number 10 screw and at least 3 inches long, and no drywall or other bugle head screws may be used. AWS 2, second edition, requires a minimum of 1.5 inches of penetration into the wall blocking. So depending on how thick the drywall is on the structural wall, or how thick your back and anchor strip assembly are, you might actually need a screw longer than 3 inches in order to meet the AWS 2 requirement. Also, there needs to be at least 2 fasteners at the top and 2 at the bottom. And for a row of fasteners horizontally, they can be spaced no more than 16 inches apart on center. There is also a requirement in AWS 1 that the screws in the corner be placed 2 inches by 2 inches from the outside surface of the cabinet top and the cabinet side. Now, I'm not quite sure why that measurement is put in terms of the outside of the cabinet, since typically if you're installing this, you're going to be measuring from the inside surface, but what that translates into is that it's 1.25 inches from the side and from the top at the inside of the cabinet. AWS 2 increased that dimension to 3 inches by 3 inches, so that on the inside you are then 2.25 by 2.25 inches. So that makes it a lot easier to fit a cordless drill or screw gun into that cabinet when you're installing it. Item 3 that we see quite a bit. We all know that a project with any amount of casework is very likely going to require a final adjustment of the doors and drawer fronts after the cabinets are installed. The AWS tolerances for the various parameters of that adjustment appear in Section 10 as product fabrication standards. The casework installation standards at the end of Section 10 refer you back to the manufacturing standards earlier in Section 10 as the guide for doing your on-site door and drawer front adjustments. So the three parameters involved in this adjustment: the face edges that you see here shall align to within 1/32 inch plus or minus. Secondly, the faces shall be coplanar, that is, within the same vertical plane within 1/32 of an inch plus or minus, and both the edge alignment and that face alignment tolerance applies to both custom and premium grade. And finally, gaps between faces shall be 1/8 of an inch plus or minus 1/16 of an inch if it's a custom grade project, or plus or minus 1/32 for premium grade. It's a little bit hard to see, but in this next photograph here, this is a cabinet run from a project that was inspected a couple of weeks ago, and the door bodies in this entire project were out of square by something like a quarter of an inch, and consequently the applied drawer fronts throughout the projects are in kind of a sawtooth configuration where one drawer front end sticks out about 3/8 of an inch from the adjacent end of the next drawer front. In other words, the drawer fronts are all badly out of plane, not only with each other, but also with the doors below them. And a project-wide issue like this would obviously have to be corrected before certification could be considered. In general, here's a general comment on the issue of door and drawer front adjustments and tolerances. Inspectors are not going to be looking for absolute perfection, especially where you have a larger project where there might be hundreds or sometimes even thousands of doors and drawer fronts. What they do look for is an overall impression of what the standards call first-class workmanship. That's not to say they are not going to test gaps and all of that stuff in a number of locations. But when we see a systematic and repetitive issue like the one that occurred in the picture here, that's a whole different story and something that would make a project ineligible for certification unless that is corrected. Next thing that comes up pretty regularly is the spacing in cabinet body parts of dowels. We're going to start with wood dowel assembly, and then we're going to look at European-style dowel screws. For both AWS 1 and 2, the dowel must be a minimum of 5/16 in diameter and 1 3/16 long. There's no set limit on the maximum diameter or length, so beyond the minimum requirement, it's your call as to what dowel size you think is going to do the most effective job. Both AWS 1 and 2 state that if wood dowels are used for case construction, they must be glued and the cases must be clamped. And that clamping can be done with actual clamps or with generic assembly screws. A wood dowel joint must have at least 2 dowels per joint. You can see in the photograph on the right here that this particular woodworker felt a little more comfortable with 3 dowels for joining what appears to be a stretcher to the case body. Now, the aspects I've just mentioned, they are the same in editions 1 and 2, but there are a couple important differences. These diagrams were cropped from AWS 1 and 2, and what you see in each is the edge view of a casework component, which looks probably like a typical cabinet bottom, perhaps. The left end will be the the front edge of the cabinet. You can see the extra little line there denoting the edge banding. So starting from the left in the upper diagram, we see that AWS 1 allows a maximum of 1 15/16 inches from the front edge of that component to the center of the first dowel. Note that there is no minimum setback stated. So again, as the manufacturer, you decide where that dowel is most efficiently placed as long as that 1 15/16 maximum dimension is observed. Then in the lower diagram, we see that the Joint Standards Committee has seen fit to round off the 1 15/16 to 2 inches. Going back to the upper diagram, we see that the dowel's on-center interval, that is after the first dowel, must be no less than 3 inches and no more than 3 21/32 of an inch, which is a nice round number, I guess. The lower AWS 2 diagram agrees that the maximum on-center spacing is 3 21/32, but there is no minimum spacing, which is at the woodworker's discretion. So you can load up a component like that with as many dowels as you see fit. Going to the right end of that cabinet component in the upper AWS 1 diagram, you see a dimension, a maximum dimension of 1 15/16 for placement of that outside dowel at the back edge of the component. So that AWS 1 treats it just like the front edge. The lower diagram for AWS 2 shows that the maximum limit at the back edge of that part has been eliminated. I don't know why for sure, but I suspect that was done to give woodworkers a little more flexibility to place that back dowel so that it can comfortably clear the machining for the cabinet back and anchor strips and so forth. This diagram, or these two diagrams, talk about spacing of cabinet body dowel screws. For both AWS 1 and 2, they've got to be a minimum of 7 millimeters in diameter and 51 millimeters in length, which is pretty standard. For dowel screws, no glue is required. Dowel screw placement for the casework bodies, it's very similar to that of the wood dowel placement we just looked at. Again, we've got the 1 15/16 maximum location from the component's front edge at the left of the diagram. After that first screw is located, there is no minimum for an on-center interval, only a maximum of 5 inches. And as was the case with the wood dowels, AWS 1 keeps that maximum 1 15/16 inches at the back edge of the component, but AWS 2 has again eliminated that requirement. Something else that comes up fairly often is the sealing of sink cutouts, and usually it's not a case of 1 or 2 cutouts having been missed by the manufacturer installer. Typically, if one sink cutout is not sealed, none of the sink cutouts in the project have been sealed, and that would require correction for project certification. The standard mentions color toning of the sealer, and that's great because it is hard to see the cutout edges once the sink is installed, but frankly an inspector is going to be primarily concerned with whether or not the sealer is there at all. One sealant that many companies use that works great is plain old silicone or high silicone content caulk, which most installers already carry around with them, and in a pinch you can apply it with a finger, so that's pretty handy. If a plumber is doing the sink cutouts, hopefully you've got project contract documents specifying who is responsible for sealing the cutout edges. If it's a project with dozens of sinks and edge sealing responsibility is ambiguous, maybe that would be a good thing to clarify. If sink edges in an inspected project, the inspector notes that, we would probably ask the woodworker for some kind of documentation that states that it is not his responsibility. This is another frequent flyer item. The cladding on the inside faces of P-lam doors and applied drawer fronts shall be the same thickness as the cladding on the outside face for custom grade, and additionally for premium grade, the inside cladding has to be the same color and or pattern as the outside face. Often what we see if that requirement is not met is that there's melamine or cabinet liner on the door backs, and neither of those are allowed if the front face is either vertical or horizontal grade laminate. But from time to time we see maybe white laminate specified by the designer because they just like to look better because it matches the inside of the cabinet, and if that happens, of course, that's a specification and you're fine. But if you as the woodworker would like to change the requirements of identical thickness and or color, that's something you would have to have specific written permission for, along the lines of what Greg was talking about earlier. From time to time, we also encounter projects with edge banding specifications which are missed by the manufacturer, and that can be a problem since parts are edge banded, of course, pretty early in the process, and it can be costly to correct that error. In particular, the specification that is missed is the requirement for 3mm edge banding or laminate edge banding as opposed to PVC tape. And we recently inspected one such project in which it may have been possible for us to detect that particular error during the shop drawing review, but the materials list wasn't there, so we could not. Now we come to wall scribe. AWS 1 and AWS 2 wall filler requirements are pretty identical. Per both editions, there must be closure at all visible voids between cabinets and other surfaces, which of course is primarily going to be structural walls. A filler is required to be at least 3/4 of an inch thick, and where fillers form a corner, the corner must be mitered. In the case of an architectural drawing or some other contract document which requires you to hold cabinets, for example, between two walls, if you're required to hold all of the individual cabinets to a specific width dimension, then any width of a filler is going to be out of your control. So in that case, if a wall scribe exceeds the inch and a half maximum, that's going to be considered to be a specification, and the standard really doesn't even apply. However, again, in other situations where you as the woodworker want to make a change that is going to exceed that inch and a half maximum width, you would need to have permission for that in writing from the owner or architect. Let's assume that we've got some wall cabinets with no soffit panel above them. Voids between a structural wall and a wall cabinet must be closed, not only at the cabinet's front, but also at its top and underside. In the general information section at the beginning of AWS Section 10, before the rules start, it's stated that a cabinet top side more than 80 inches above the finished floor is considered concealed, and therefore non-visible unless it can be seen from a stairway or a mezzanine or some other higher vantage point like that. And that, of course, means that most voids at wall cabinet tops are non-visible, like the one you see in the slide here. So you've got a couple options for that top void there. You can close it with a filler, or you can, if it's a custom grade job, you could also apply a plastic laminate cap to close that void if that void is 1.5 inches or less. And that laminate can be any color, so that's a great way to get rid of the 19 leftover sheets of chartreuse P-lam you have in the storage rack there. But note that per the standard, the P-lam cap option is available only for custom grade, not for premium grade. Looking at the cabinet bottom, most wall cabinet undersides are considered to be exposed surfaces because, again, Section 10 defines a cabinet underside more than 24 inches above the floor to be an exposed surface, just like a door would be considered to be. Any void next to an exposed surface must be closed with a 3/4 inch thick filler, and whether custom or premium grade, that filler's finish has got to match the finish of the adjacent exposed surfaces. And again, wherever two fillers come together at 90 degrees, that joint has got to be mitered. That requirement for filling voids extends to voids like this one, where a couple wall cabinet rungs are coming together at 90 degrees in the corner of a structural wall. There's one other issue that's related to wall cabinet undersides which comes up, and that is when cabinet sides are extended to receive the ends of a light rail. Both AWS editions say that the interior exposed surfaces of the ends, and the red arrows there are pointing to that surface. It's being referenced there. They must be of a finish compatible with exposed surfaces in the case of custom grade, or identical with the cabinet's other exposed surfaces in the case of premium grade. Drawer box material thickness is something that comes up with AWS Edition 1, but it's not going to be so much of an issue with Edition 2. AWS Edition 1 prohibits the use of 3/4 inch material for any drawer that is under 30 inches, so that's going to be a vast majority of drawers on any typical project. But AWS 2, while it does retain the minimum thickness requirements, it has eliminated a maximum thickness, so you can use 3/4 inch material for drawer bodies all day long under AWS 2. But again, if it's something you want to use under AWS 1 and you can get that approved by the architect, then you're good. Finally, something I just want to mention, it's really a topic that is too big to go into here, and in fact we did an entire webinar on this a couple sessions back, and that is veneer matching for projects which have transparent finishes. And any of you who manufacture or install this project know that there's a lot of moving parts involved, and these specifications can be very tricky. Where this item appears in an inspected project, we've seen it be an issue quite often in terms of conformance and certification. If you want to take a look at that previous webinar, you can. If you're an AWI member, you can get on AWI's website in the members only section and look at the recorded webinars. If you're not an AWI member, but you are a QCP licensee and you want to see that webinar, you can give us a call. And that is the extent of our formal presentation for today. So the floor is open to all of you. Are there any questions, comments, and so forth?
Thomas Clayton, you have a question?
The question says, if I'm reading the right question here, when is the AWS 2 certification available? And the answer to that question is if you've got any project that requires certification and that requires conformance specifically to AWS 2 or was bid after October 1st, 2014, can be certified. Here is a question from Alan that says, in figuring out the QCP contract amount on the project certification form, what items are to be included/excluded, i.e. polymer products, glass, metal items, solid surface materials, etc., in determining this amount? And I can give you an answer. Randy Estabrook, our executive director, is here, and he may want to add to this, but rule of thumb, it is anything in your contract scope that is covered by the standard. So in your example, if you are providing solid surface materials, that is included in Section 11 of both editions of the AWS, so that would be included. If you don't have installation, obviously that would not be included. So that is the rule of thumb. Have anything you want to add to that, Randy?
No, that's pretty accurate, Wayne.
Okay.
Also, Splinter had a question. If the project is sold by a broker and 3 woodworkers participate in providing parts of the project, who is responsible for paying the label fee?
Well, each fabricator that would be contributing to that project would be responsible for the label fee and the scope of work that they are providing.
Moving on.
John had a question. What if you are hurried to provide shop drawings, giving woodworker no time to send drawings in for review?
The cardinal rule of the QCP shop drawing process is that it shall not in any way hold up the project schedule. Although our review of the shop drawings is a routine part of an inspected project, at this point it is largely a courtesy for you. We don't actually certify the drawings. The purpose of our review is to try to catch errors early in the process because it's a lot easier to do that than it is once you've actually started building the stuff. So this relates back to Greg's comments earlier, because as long as the project has been registered and the certificates and or labels ordered early enough in the process, there should be no reason why there isn't usually plenty of time. I understand that there are times when you've got a very, very short delivery time, and so there's not much choice. So I guess the answer to the question is, let us hold you up. We will do the best we can with reviewing your drawing, but we are very concerned about not causing any delays in your schedule.
Yeah, let me interject in here also. The majority of the time when we review the shop drawings is typically after you've submitted them to the architect. So it's not that we have to do a shop drawing review before you send them to the architect.
Yeah, while we're talking about this issue of shop drawings and shop drawing reviews, like to get some feedback from the people that are dialed in. How many people would want us to review their shop drawings on certified projects, or any project for that matter? If we could get a show of hands on that.
That appears to be one person raising their hand.
Not many, huh? Okay.
Barely none.
No, we've got 8 people.
Oh, we do?
All right. Okay.
Okay. I must be looking at the wrong number here.
That's better.
Yeah, that is better.
The next question is, when will the AWS 2 online certification exam be available?
Good question.
That boils down to a technical question. There's new software that is being developed for AWS 2. The test is actually already written, but there are some new software requirements, and that is moving along. And a preliminary word we have from those developers is by the end of January. If you intend to take the test and you go on the website, there is information there about, if the test is not posted, and not to worry if you can't take it. We're not going to penalize you for that. And there is information about the process that will go on when the new test does come online. And there is another question from Thomas. Finished end panels approved for star materials or similar. I used finished end panels often on casework. Is there provisions for finished end panels for typical casework? I'm not sure I completely understand the question. I am frankly not familiar with the term star materials. One thing, and maybe you can clarify your question, there is in, I believe, both editions of AWS, a line item that says exposed ends of cabinets must be integral to the cabinet and not applied. I know that's the case for edition 1. I think it's the case for edition 2. I'm not absolutely sure about that. So someone could enlighten us on what a star material is. We would be interested in. Star is a brand name for a plastic type material typically used for outdoor kitchens. So that sounds like an applied panel. So, if that's specified, probably the only way you could use it is to apply it to a sub-side on a casework. So that being a specification, it would not, that in itself would not affect certification or conformance of the product. And also I should mention, for a product like that, it's for similar materials that are in the standard, that there are manufacturers' instructions for installation typically would be followed. Donna is asking, or says, I believe that I read that the top edges of wall ends have to be banded. Is that correct? And I'm assuming that you mean wall cabinets. If that's not correct, let me know. But Greg, can you speak to that question?
If we're talking about the top of wall cabinets, end panels, if it is open above, and then yes, it does have to be banded. Also, if it is a tall cabinet and open above, it has to be banded. Now, the difference is in the standards is that if it is visible from above, in other words, if it was a set of cabinets and you had a balcony above it where you could look down on top of it, then the banding and the top has to match the exterior. However, if it is just open above, so there's like a 12-inch space between the top of the cabinet and the ceiling, then it just needs to be edge banded with the edge banding material of your choice.
We have another question from Phoenix 1, which asks, will this PowerPoint slideshow be made available to us? Yes, I see that it is being recorded and will be in the same location that I referenced when I talked about the veneer matching webinar, and that is in the members only section of the AWI website. And again, if you happen to be a QCP licensee that is not an AWI member and want to know how you can see the recording for this webinar, give us a call at QCP. Anything else? That appears to be it for today. Thank you very much for your attention and participation, and we will see you again in about another quarter. Cameron, do you have anything else?
Yes, thank you. Randy, Greg, Wayne, thank you so much for your time and contributions in delivering today's webinar.